Hello, my name is Thomas Paget, and I'm a fourth year at the University of Kansas in Professor Maya Stiller's History of Arts 361 Buddhist Art History of Korea class. And today we'll be looking at an article by Professor Song Unsok's Changes in the Internal Structure of Buddhist Temple Halls and Characteristics of Buddhist Sculptures in the Late Joseon Period. So Professor Song Unsok obtained a PhD in art history from Seoul National University, which within his field of study is the most prestigious university in South Korea. He's a professor of Korean Buddhist sculpture at Dong University's Gyeongju campus, and his personal research focus is on Joseon period Buddhist sculpture. He previously worked as curator at Sungwangsa Temple Museum and the Lian Museum, and for 1 year he was a research fellow at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So Professor Song's main argument within this article is that changes made to the internal temple structure and appearance of imagery during the late Joseon period are justified by the changing political and social landscape of Korea following the Japanese invasions of the late 16th century, despite the common belief among scholars that work from this period is inferior to prior periods. So the methodology and evidence that Professor Song uses within this article is that he highlights different parts of the temple halls, and he introduces them very well, whether it's the altar itself, whether it's there or not, the height of the altar, the size of the altar in relation to the rest of the space, or the location of the high pillars that are used to frame the back of the altar. He also uses a series of precise measurements in centimeters and meters to define the space as well as the height of objects. In this article, he also uses a lot of photographs to better illustrate to the reader the appearance of these images and altars within temple halls. And because he's an expert on the subject, he's able to make a lot of really good observations and infer where there are gaps throughout the history, because a lot of the temples were destroyed or partially destroyed, as well as a few manuscripts during the Japanese invasion of Korea. And what we see today is a lot of what has been reconstructed, and that's what his research is on within the late Joseon period. He also does a lot of comparison and contrasting between the temples of older periods and their writings, between those and the late Joseon with their temples and writings. So some of the terminology that I was unfamiliar with within this article had a lot to do with the different halls within the temple complex. The first one being the Hall of the Great Hero, which is the main Buddha hall. And it's the largest and most centered hall within the temple complex. And throughout the late Joseon period, it was actually, it became more of like a multifunctional space that could really do it all. But along with this, you also have the Hall of Silence and Light, which is dedicated to the Vairocana Buddha, the Hall of Paradise, which is dedicated to the Amitabha Buddha and the Mountain Spirits, the Hall of Infinite Life, which is dedicated to the Amitabha Triad and the Western Pure Lands. And lastly, we have two terms that describe the placement of the internal high pillars within the halls. So Zhangjipup is the common placement method, which we will better illustrate later on in this presentation. And Ishibup is the pillar relocation method, which is more prevalent within the late Joseon. So just a preface to the rest of this presentation, the late Joseon was post-Japanese invasion, and Buddhism at this point had fallen out of favor amongst government nobility. And that meant that halls and temples had to be funded by lay people and the poor, so that there was a larger amount of people with almost as much money, but it took a lot more people to accumulate the revenue or the money that would keep the temples running and in at least some sort of power. And also because Buddhism had fallen out of favor amongst the government nobility, all of the rituals and ceremonies had to take place within the temple complex. So altar prevalence, there actually was not much prevalence of altars within the unified Silla, Goryeo, or even early Joseon periods. And they appeared to display imagery. The Muisa altar in the Hall of Paradise in Gangjin was the earliest found, and it was in the early Joseon period. And while it's not necessarily the same as altars found in the late Joseon, it certainly created the prototypical precedent, as it was the first to have surface enough to accommodate a holy image and enough space even to hold an arrangement of offerings and holy images. It also had storage within the back portion of the altar, which was very important as the criteria. So regarding altar size in the late Joseon, as these altars became more prevalent and mainstream, they also grew in size. And the reason for that is they had a higher influx of people, and like I said earlier, it was the poorer people that were having to make up for the lost revenue of the nobles who were no longer participating in the community. So by having a larger number of people and a larger frequency of services, there were more offerings to be placed on the altar, which needed to be larger. So the Muisa altar, which was previously shown, took up 7% of the overall floor space within the hall, whereas throughout much of the late Joseon, 11 to 16% of the floor space was taken up by the altar. So here's a quick table that I put together that displays just some percentages or ratios of altar to floor space within these respective halls. And you can pause to better understand this as I will keep going. So another thing that changed to accommodate more people in space was the location of the altars. And because they were so big and it was an opportunity to structurally frame the building, the Zhangjipup method, which had been prevalent in the early Joseon and even the early portion of the late Joseon period, had the internal pillars that framed the altar in line with the second row from the rear of high pillars. Whereas once the altar was pushed back to create more space, it became the Ijiban method, where the pillars were no longer in line. That is evidenced here on the right side with some quick diagrams over some existing floor plans. There's also a transition from brick flooring to wood flooring. Every temple within the Goryeo period was brick floored, but as these temples were reconstructed for the late Joseon period, portable wooden floors and permanent wooden floors took prevalence. And this is because they were trying to get more involvement within the community from the lay people. And for physical interaction with the floor, it was more comfortable to interact with wood as opposed to brick. And by having permanent wood floors as opposed to portable wood floors, there was no need for storage to store the portable wood floors. So that's why they made that transition to wood from brick. The altar also grew taller throughout the Joseon period. And this was because as it was moved back, the images on top of the pedestals on top of the altar were harder to see. So they increased the height of all of them. And in doing so, the individuals that had come to worship these objects could not really see the faces. They looked diminished, and it was hard to create that sense of reverence and holiness. So they made the heads larger and the shoulders more hunched forward, as opposed to the more stoic shoulders back, straight back appearance of the imagery. As well as the fact that behind these altars and the images, there was a transition from the mandorla or halos to painted scrolls, which could encompass more imagery at once. And all of this increased in such height that the altar itself was roughly 1 meter tall. And prior to the altars being used, the images were just placed on pedestals, but the pedestals came with the images. So layered, it was altar, pedestal, image. And with an altar that's roughly 1 meter high, a pedestal that is anywhere from 50 to 150 centimeters, and then an image that is anywhere from 100 to 300 centimeters, there was a great variance in tall heights for these combinations. So my thoughts on Professor Song's article is I largely agree with what he has to say. He was pointing out that the work is not inferior to prior periods because it's different. It's different because it had to serve a purpose to keep going. And he illustrated that very well within his methodology and evidence, which I believe created an extremely strong argument. And within the article, he uses a lot of primary and secondary sources. And he kind of he poses the argument to the belief that the work is inferior, but he actually introduces the idea that people find it inferior because they have a reduced perspective on the work. And I personally would actually like to know a lot more about period-centric differences in spatial design as an architecture student. I think it's very interesting how the usage of space changes over time in regards to its contemporary function. And lastly, we have our bibliography, in which we credit Professor Song Unsok's article, as well as an article that better explains the different types of halls within the temple complex. Thank you.